The war room was huge and dark, with walls made of black metal and strange glowing lines running across them. The light from those lines made the shadows look alive, moving like they had their own will. The table in the center was long and narrow, made of some hard alien stone that looked smooth like glass. Around it sat dozens of alien officers, generals, and diplomats, each one from a different world. Their bodies were covered in armor or ceremonial robes. Some had sharp claws resting on the table. Others had tails curled around the legs of their chairs. The air was heavy with the smell of strange plants burning in small bowls. A custom of the host species, the sound of a low hum came from machines hidden in the walls, like the room itself was breathing. At the far end of the table sat Sergeant Mason, the only human in the room. His armor was scratched and dented, with burns and marks from battles that most of the aliens in the room could not even imagine. His helmet was off, placed on the table in front of him. His hair was short and dark, his face rough, with small scars across his jaw and above his right eyebrow. His eyes moved slowly from one alien to another, not in fear, not even in challenge, but like a predator watching a group that might try something foolish. They had called him here for one reason: to answer questions about the human role in the war that was spreading through the outer sectors of the galaxy. Humans were new to the galactic stage, but they had gained a reputation far faster than anyone had expected. Entire fleets had been destroyed by human-led forces. Battles that should have lasted days ended in hours. And now these alien leaders wanted to understand how. They wanted to know what made humans fight the way they did. The room had been filled with careful words before he arrived, polite greetings, slow exchanges. But now, with the humans sitting there, the energy had changed. The aliens spoke less, their voices lower. Some avoided looking directly at him. Others stared like they were studying a dangerous creature. Finally, one of them moved. It was Commander Thras, a tall alien with four glowing eyes and skin like smooth bronze. His uniform was dark green with bright silver stripes across the chest. He leaned forward, his long fingers tapping against the table, and his voice came out deep and steady, though there was a faint edge to it, like a man asking a question he already feared to hear answered. "How many have you killed?" he said, the words echoing in the silent room, carried by the translator in Mason's ear. Every eye turned to Mason. The air seemed to tighten. The hum of the machines felt louder. The flames in the bowls flickered, as if reacting to the tension. Some aliens leaned back, waiting. Others leaned forward, curious. No one moved their hands toward their weapons, but no one was fully relaxed either. Mason did not answer right away. He sat still, his hands resting on the table, fingers loose but steady, his face unreadable. The silence stretched, long enough for the air to feel heavy in the lungs. A few aliens shifted in their seats, their tails twitching. One diplomat's claws scraped lightly against the table, the sound sharp in the stillness. Then Mason smiled, not wide, not friendly, but slow and dangerous, the kind of smile that said he already knew the answer to the question but was deciding whether to give it. His eyes locked on Commander Thras, unblinking. The room seemed to grow colder though the firelight was still burning. "This year," he said, his voice calm, even soft, or just this planet. The words slid into the air like a blade. There was no boast in them, no joke, no hesitation, only a strange and terrible truth. The meaning landed differently for each alien in the room, but all of them felt the same thing, a sudden and deep understanding that the human was not counting battles in years or even decades, but in the number of places where he had ended lives. A low sound moved through the room, not speech exactly, more like the small noises a group makes when they all feel the same sharp thought at once. One alien general's eyes narrowed, his mouth opening slightly before he closed it again. Another turned his gaze down to the table, avoiding Mason's eyes. The ambassador from the Vrel system pulled at the edge of her robe as if adjusting it, though her hands were shaking just slightly. Commander Thras did not look away, but there was a flicker in his four glowing eyes, something that might have been the beginning of doubt, or fear, or both. He had asked the question thinking the human would give a number, maybe even a story to show off his skill, but he had not expected this answer, an answer that carried no fixed value, because the number might be too large to measure, and because Mason had spoken it as if it was simply normal. No one spoke for several long seconds. The only sounds were the hum of the machines and the soft hiss of the burning plants in the bowls. The smell seemed sharper now, the air thicker, like it was harder to breathe. Mason's smile faded, but his eyes stayed locked on the commander, a small tilt of his head the only movement he made. In that moment, the aliens in the room began to realize something important. Mason had not given his kill count because he did not keep one. Not in the way they did. He did not mark every life taken as a point to add to some total. For him, it was something else, something woven into his work, something constant. He did not separate the kills by year, by battle, or by planet, because the act was not separate from his life as a soldier. It was his life. The thought moved quietly from one mind to another, and none of them liked where it led. Because if a human could speak of killing with such calm, such distance, what else could they speak of in the same way? What else could they do without hesitation, without doubt, without the fear that most species carry before a fight? The question had been meant to measure him, to put his danger into numbers, but now they understood there was no safe number to hold, and the meeting had only just begun. The air inside the war room felt heavier now, as if the answer Mason had given was not just words, but something physical pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. The strange light from the walls reflected in the eyes of the alien officers, making them look less like leaders of great fleets and more like prey caught in a beam of a predator's gaze. The bowls of burning plants still gave off their slow, thin smoke, curling toward the ceiling in shapes that twisted and broke apart. The low hum of the hidden machines no longer felt like a calm background sound, but like the slow, deep breathing of something ancient and waiting. No one spoke at first, and in that quiet the details became sharper. Mason's fingers resting lightly on the table, the faint scratch on the back of his left glove, the way his shadow stretched behind him, long and distorted by the light. One alien general shifted in his seat, the scales on his neck moving like a ripple in dark water. Another officer's ears twitched back against his skull in an instinctive sign of unease. A diplomat from a world of ice let out a slow breath that froze into a faint mist in the air before fading away. Commander Thress was still leaning forward, though now his fingers had stopped tapping against the table. The glow in his four eyes was steady but not as bright as before. His mouth opened as if to speak again, but closed without sound. His mind was replaying Mason's words, turning them over, looking for some hidden boast or empty threat. But there had been none, only the raw, simple truth that the human had delivered without raising his voice, without leaning forward, without needing to prove anything. One of the younger officers spoke up from the far side of the table, his voice carrying the sharp accent of the Kesari homeworld. "Why would you measure kills by a planet?" he asked, the translator repeating the question in the air. The tone was half curiosity and half disbelief, as if he could not quite understand whether Mason's words had been meant as a joke. Mason turned his head slightly toward the voice, his expression calm, and for a moment it looked as if he might answer, but instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving across the table slowly, measuring each alien face before him. The silence stretched again, and it became a thing with its own weight, a silence that felt deliberate, a silence that made those who heard it think of places where sound did not belong. Battlefields after the fighting had ended, ruins where nothing moved, ships drifting cold in the void with no crew to speak. Every second of quiet seemed to press the question harder into the minds of the listeners, not the question of how many, but the question of what kind of being could answer that way. Some of the aliens tried to read his body language, but Mason's posture was unreadable to most of them. Humans did not carry their fear in the same ways as other species. The muscles in his face did not twitch. His hands stayed still. Even the way he breathed was slow and steady, like someone sitting at home, not someone surrounded by the most powerful military leaders of a dozen worlds. And the more they looked, the more they began to understand that he was not trying to act calm. He simply was. An older alien with deep blue skin and silver markings across his skull cleared his throat and asked in a voice heavy with formality, "Sergeant Mason, are you telling us that you have killed on more than one planet this year alone?" The translator gave the words a cold edge. Mason tilted his head slightly, as if thinking about whether the question deserved an answer, then spoke with that same quiet, even tone. I am telling you that I have fought on more than one planet this year. What happened? On those planets depends on which side you ask. The words made a few aliens shift in their chairs again. The diplomat from the ice world looked down at her folded hands. The younger Kisari officer leaned back, as if trying to put more distance between himself and the human. Even Commander Thress's jaw tightened in a small sign of discomfort. The idea that the truth of what happened could change depending on who told the story was not foreign to them. But hearing it from someone who could make such a statement without any sign of regret was different. It was unsettling in a way that was hard to describe. The silence after his answer was not as long as before, but it felt sharper, like the space between one heartbeat and the next, a moment where something might happen. The tension in the room was no longer only about the question of numbers. It was about the man himself, the way he seemed to carry the presence of all those unseen battlefields into this room, the way his voice and his eyes made each alien wonder how close they might be to becoming just another story he would tell without raising his voice. The burning plants hissed softly as another small piece of resin dropped into the bowl, sending up a quick burst of smoke. The smell grew thicker, and for a moment the light seemed dimmer. Mason leaned forward just slightly, enough for the chair to creak under his weight, and without looking at anyone in particular, he asked, "Do you want to know the number because it will make you feel safer, or because it will tell you when to be afraid?" No one answered, and in the pause that followed, he leaned back again. The sound of his armor shifting against the chair was the loudest thing in the room. The question hung there like a shadow, and though it had been asked softly, it seemed to fill every corner of the chamber. Some of the aliens realized that they had not been afraid of the number at all. They had been afraid of what the number might mean about him, about humans, about the kind of war they could bring if they chose to. The silence returned, but now it was not just the absence of words. It was a living thing in the room, something that made the air thicker, something that made every movement feel too loud. And though no one spoke, every alien present knew the meeting had already changed. The human had not raised his voice, had not moved to threaten anyone, yet the balance in the room had shifted toward him without effort. And the worst part was that Mason seemed completely at ease with it. The room remained caught in the heavy quiet that Mason had built with so few words. Every alien in the chamber sat with the question still lingering in their minds. Some stared at the human, as if hoping his expression would change and reveal something. Others avoided his eyes entirely. The slow curl of smoke from the burning bowls drifted through the dim light, breaking apart in thin streams that twisted like restless spirits. The hum of the machines in the walls was steady and slow, like a pulse that belonged to the place itself. An ambassador from the desert world of Thale leaned forward, her pale, golden skin reflecting the wall lights. She spoke with the smooth, careful tone of someone used to talking in dangerous rooms. "Sergeant Mason, perhaps you would tell us a story instead of a number," she said, the translator giving her voice a softer edge. "Perhaps then we can understand what you mean." Mason's eyes shifted toward her, his head tilting slightly as though weighing her request. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence settle again. Then his voice came low and even. "I can tell you about one night," he said. His words carried no rush. "It was on a moon without a name, just a number in your records. We were sent there because your fleets had lost 3 times trying to take it." The aliens listened closely, their eyes fixed on him, the younger officers leaning forward now, despite themselves. Mason's voice did not rise or fall much, yet there was something in it that pulled them in. The air there was thick with ash. The ground shook every few minutes from the bombardments. The enemy had dug deep under the rock, miles of tunnels, traps, and machines waiting for us. Your fleets tried to burn them out, but you never went down into the dark. A ripple of unease moved around the table. The word dark seemed to hold more weight when Mason said it. "We went in at night," he continued. "No lights, no armor that could make a sound. The tunnels were tight. Every corner could hide something. We moved slow, breathing through filters, hearing only the sound of our boots on the rock." One of the generals shifted in his chair, claws tapping lightly against the armrest. Mason's eyes passed over him before returning to the ambassador. "In the first 2 hours we lost 3 men. They were ahead of me, and they simply vanished into the walls. The traps didn't just kill, They took you away so no one could find the body. No one could even know what had happened. The smell of the burning plants seemed stronger now, mixing with the faint scent of machine oil that clung to Mason's armor. By the fourth hour, the air was so bad that our filters were failing. We found their command post deep under the moon's surface. It was filled with machines running the defenses, and it was guarded by more of them than you would think possible in such a space. A younger officer from the silver-skinned Alari leaned forward. "How did you get through?" he asked, his voice breaking the spell for a moment. Mason's head turned slowly toward him. "We didn't," he said. "We went around, and we sealed the doors from the outside. We cut off the air vents. We let the dark do the rest." Several aliens flinched. One even turned his head away, as if trying to push the image out of his mind. Mason kept speaking, his voice unchanged. "We waited outside in the tunnels, silent, listening. The sounds inside went on for hours, and when it stopped, we opened the doors and cleared what was left." The ambassador's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "And how many?" she began, but Mason cut her off gently. "Enough that your fleets took the moon the next day without firing another shot." His eyes swept over the table, pausing on each face for just long enough to make the silence deeper again. "You see," he said quietly, "numbers do not tell you what happened. They do not tell you why the ground stayed black for months. They do not tell you why the air smelled of metal and fire long after the fighting ended. They do not tell you why none of us could sleep in the dark without waking up ready to fight." The aliens sat in stillness, and in that stillness they began to feel the truth behind his words. They had asked for a kill count, as if war could be measured like trade goods, as if every life ended could be placed in a neat line and counted without the weight of what it meant. But Mason's voice had made it clear that the weight was always there, even if you did not speak of it. One of the more decorated generals, his armor shining faintly under the dim light, cleared his throat and said, "Sergeant Mason, you speak as if it is nothing to you." Mason's gaze met his without a blink. "If it were nothing to me," he said, "I would not remember the faces." The words settled over the room like dust after a collapse. Fine and inescapable, some of the aliens shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others kept perfectly still, as if moving might break something fragile in the air. The smell of smoke clung to everything now. The lights seemed dimmer, though none of them had changed. Mason leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the arms, his armor creaking softly as he moved. "You want numbers because numbers feel safe," he said, "but safety is not in the numbers. It is in who is left standing when the numbers are gone." No one spoke after that, and for a long moment the room was filled only with the hum of the walls and the faint hiss from the burning bowls. The alien leaders were realizing that the question they had begun with was the wrong one entirely. The real question was not how many the human had killed, but how far he would go when the fight was his to win. And none of them were certain they wanted to know the answer. The council chamber felt colder now, though no one had touched the controls for the temperature. The smoke from the burning bowls hung lower in the air, as if it too wished to listen. The alien leaders had not spoken for several long moments, and when they did, it was with the careful slowness of beings who sensed they were close to something dangerous. An officer with red-scaled skin and eyes like molten gold leaned forward, his claws tapping lightly against the black stone table. "Human," he said, the translator making the words sharp and precise. "Your people are young to the stars, yet you speak of battles as if you have been at war for centuries. How can that be?" Mason's gaze moved toward the speaker, his eyes calm, but carrying something in them that made the officer straighten in his seat. "Because we have been at war for centuries," Mason replied, his voice even and without pride. "Before we left our own world, we fought each other for thousands of years. Every kind of war you can imagine. Every kind you cannot. We fought over land, over belief, over resources, over pride. We fought with sticks and stones, then with steel and fire, then with machines. And weapons that could burn cities to the ground in a single night." The aliens shifted in their seats, some leaning away slightly as if the human's words carried heat, others leaning closer as if drawn by the gravity of what he said. "When we came to the stars, we did not leave that behind." Mason continued. "The only thing that changed was where the war happened and who it was with. The skills were already there. We just used them in new places." A diplomat with long silver hair and translucent skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light spoke next. her voice a soft chime through the translator. "You make it sound as if war is in your blood." Mason's eyes flicked toward her, and for the first time there was the faintest shadow of a smile. "It is not in our blood," he said. "It is in our history, and history shapes you in ways you cannot erase." One of the younger officers gave a small snort, a sound of disbelief. "If you fought each other for so long, then why are you still here? Why did you not destroy yourselves before reaching the stars?" Mason turned his head toward the voice, his tone still quiet, but now carrying something colder. "Because we learned how to stop before we burn the world, but we also learned that when the fight is necessary, you do not stop until it is over." The older generals in the room seemed to understand the weight of that answer more than the younger ones. They knew what it meant for a species to carry such a long memory of violence. They knew it was not just skill in battle, but a certain way of thinking, a readiness that never truly went away. "Your fleets are small compared to ours," Commander Thress finally said, breaking his long silence. "Yet you win battles we have lost. Is this why?" Mason did not hesitate. "You fight to win the battle," he said. "We fight so the war does not come back. There is a difference." The words settled heavily over the table. Some of the aliens frowned, as if trying to measure the meaning. Others looked down at their hands as though the answer had been aimed at them directly. The smoke in the air seemed thicker now, the light dimmer. Though nothing had truly changed, it was as if the atmosphere itself was reacting to the shift in the room. A general with armor marked by long, jagged scars leaned forward, his deep voice rumbling. "So if you fight to end the war, what do you do with those who surrender?" Mason's gaze met his without blinking. "If they surrender before it is over, we take them in. If they surrender after, there is no one left to take in." Several pairs of alien eyes flickered or narrowed. The translator had delivered the words without emotion, but the meaning was sharp enough to cut. The silence that followed was shorter this time, but heavier. The aliens were beginning to understand that the humans' view of war was not simply ruthless. It was absolute. One of the ambassadors whispered to another, but the sound carried just enough for Mason to hear. "Perhaps they are too dangerous to trust." Mason's eyes turned toward her slowly, his voice quiet but clear. "Perhaps, but you are the ones who called me here, not the other way around." The truth in that sentence was undeniable. The council had invited him into this room, had asked him their questions, had given him the space to speak, and now they were the ones feeling the weight of his answers. None of them moved to leave, but none of them felt as sure of themselves as they had when the meeting began. The burning bowls hissed softly as another piece of resin dropped into the coals, sending up a burst of darker smoke. Mason leaned forward just slightly, enough for his armor to creak. "You want to understand humans," he said. "Then understand this: we do not think in battles. We think in wars, and we do not think in years. We think in generations." There was no arrogance in the tone, only a kind of certainty that was more unsettling than any threat. Some of the alien leaders shifted in their seats again. Others stared at the table, avoiding the humans' eyes entirely. They were realizing that this was not just a soldier they were speaking to, but the product of a long and violent history that no amount of peace could truly erase. Commander Thress spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Then perhaps it is good that you are on our side." Mason's gaze met his, and for a moment there was no expression at all on his face. "For now," he said, and the two words carried more weight than 1,000 promises. The council chamber fell into silence again. But it was a different silence than before. It was the silence of people who had been shown something they could not unsee. And though the meeting was not over yet, they all knew it had already changed the way they would think about humans, about war, and about the man sitting at the end of the table. And somewhere in that quiet, Mason knew they were beginning to understand why they should never have asked the question in the first place. The air in the council chamber was heavy now, with the smell of the burning resin and the weight of the words that had been spoken. The alien leaders were no longer sitting with the same confident stillness they had shown at the start. Some shifted in their seats. Others kept glancing toward the door, as if remembering there was a way out. The light from the walls cast long shadows that reached across the table and touched the faces of those who were trying to hide their unease. Mason sat where he had been from the beginning, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. A voice broke the silence, sharp and uncertain. It came from a tall figure with a long mane of dark hair that shimmered like metal. Her armor was ceremonial, but her eyes were those of a warrior. "You say you fight so the war never comes back," she said, her words carrying through the translator with a slight tremor. "But that makes you sound more dangerous than the enemy we are facing. If you will fight without stopping, then how can we be sure you will ever stop at all?" Several heads turned toward Mason, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his tone calm. "Because when the war is over, I do not need to keep fighting to prove anything. I fight until the threat is gone, not until I'm satisfied." The answer did not bring comfort to all. One of the ambassadors from the trade worlds leaned forward, his many eyes blinking in slow sequence. "But how do we know what you consider a threat?" Mason's gaze turned to him, and the air seemed to grow tighter. "If you have to ask that," he said quietly, "then you already know the answer." Murmurs moved around the table, some voices low and tense, others sharp and doubtful. The council was no longer a single body of united purpose. The question of whether the humans were allies or another kind of danger was now on the table. The debate began in careful tones, but quickly grew into overlapping voices. One general saying humans were the only reason the enemy had been pushed back. Another arguing that no one who spoke of killing with such calm could be trusted fully. An ambassador warning that fear of humans might push neutral worlds toward the other side. Through it all, Mason sat in silence, his eyes moving from speaker to speaker, not to interrupt but to watch, the way a hunter watches the movement of prey before choosing where to strike. The sound of their voices rose and fell like the tide, sharp words mixed with softer appeals. The burning bowls hissed and popped as resin cracked in the heat. The air thickened with both smoke and tension. Commander Thress finally raised a hand, and the voices slowed, though they did not stop entirely. "This is not the time for fear," he said. "We must decide based on reason, not on the weight of a few stories." His tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed the unease that had not left him since Mason's first answer. "Sergeant Mason, what would you say to those here who believe you and your kind are as much a threat as the enemy we fight?" Mason leaned forward slightly, his armor creaking with the movement. His voice was quiet but carried across the room. "I would say they're not wrong to be cautious," he said. "Humans are dangerous. I'm dangerous, but the difference between us and the enemy is simple. When we fight beside you, we fight to make sure you survive. When they fight beside you, they fight to make sure you fall." His words cut through the room like a blade. The murmurs faded into stillness again. The meaning was too sharp to ignore. Several aliens exchanged glances, some with uncertainty, others with the first signs of reluctant agreement. Mason's gaze did not waver as he spoke again. "If you fear us, keep us close. It is easier to watch an ally than an enemy." The sentence landed with a strange kind of weight. It was not a threat. It was not a comfort. It was simply a truth laid bare, the kind of truth that forced the listeners to think about the shape of their own choices. The room felt smaller now, the shadows longer, the hum of the hidden machines louder. One of the younger officers spoke up, his voice tight with something between fear and curiosity. "And if we chose not to keep you close?" Mason looked at him with the same calm he had shown from the start. "Then you would see what it means to face us from the other side." The officer fell silent, his eyes dropping to the table. No one moved to speak after that, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. The burning resin sent up another wave of thick smoke that curled toward the ceiling before breaking apart. The lights seemed dimmer still, the chamber quieter than it had been all night. Commander Thress finally spoke, his tone slow and measured. "Then it seems the choice is not whether we trust you completely, but whether we can afford not to." His words drew a few nods from around the table, though others remained still. Mason gave no sign of victory or satisfaction. He only leaned back again, letting the silence do the rest of the work. In that silence, the council began to understand that the human had turned the room without raising his voice, without threatening them directly, without giving them numbers. He had made them see that their survival might depend on the very thing they feared, and once that thought was in their minds, it could not be removed. The meeting was not over, but the balance had shifted. The question was no longer if they would work with the humans. It was how they would do it without losing control. And Mason sat in his chair like a man who had already known the answer before they asked the first question. The smoke drifted lazily in the air, the shadows moved with the light, and somewhere deep inside each of them was the quiet realization that they might never truly understand what it meant to be human, but they would know well enough to keep one on their side rather than across the battlefield. And Mason, without changing his expression, knew that was enough. The council chamber was still heavy with the tension of the last words spoken, yet it seemed no one wished to move, first for fear of breaking the thin balance that had been formed, but balance is a fragile thing, and it only takes one voice to tilt it. From the far end of the table, a tall, broad figure rose, his scaled skin glimmering under the dim light, each movement deliberate like a predator, making sure its prey was watching. His armor bore deep marks that could only have been earned in battle. His crest was chipped from old strikes, yet his eyes held the spark of someone who had never truly accepted defeat. He was Commander Varric, known in the outer sectors for his brutal style, and his unwillingness to back down once engaged. His voice was low, but carried a rumble that seemed to settle in the bones of those who heard it. "I have heard enough talk," Varric said, letting his gaze fall squarely on Mason. "I want to see what you are without the stories, without the whispers. I want to see if the human marine is as dangerous as his words suggest." Several members of the council shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered to one another, others looked toward Commander Thress, who sat frozen between caution and curiosity. Mason did not move. At first, his eyes fixed on Varric, as if measuring the man from the inside out. His fingers flexed once on the arm of his chair, before he slowly rose to his feet. "You want proof," Mason said, his tone carrying no rise or fall, just a flat weight that made the room feel smaller. "Proof will change nothing." "It will change everything," Varric replied, his voice like a growl. "If you are what they say, then we will know how far to trust you, and if you are less than that, then the fear is wasted." Mason stepped around the chair, moving with a slow precision that made each step sound louder in the stillness of the chamber. Varric moved as well, meeting him halfway. Across the long table spaced the eyes of every leader and officer fixed on them. The air felt thicker, now the faint sound of the burning resin hissing in the bowls like small reminders of heat. When Mason stopped, he stood just outside the reach of Varric, his height slightly less, but his presence somehow more. It was not the size of the man, it was the stillness that made the air press down. "You think danger is something you can see," Mason said, his voice calm. "You think it is in the muscle or the armor or the scars. Danger is in the choice to end something before it can move again. Danger is in the moment between thought and action, when nothing can stop it once it begins." Varric bared his teeth in what might have been a smile or a warning, and then he moved. His strike was fast, his scaled arm swinging toward Mason with enough force to drop most warriors. Mason did not step back. Instead, his hand shot up and caught Varric's wrist in midair. The sound of the impact was sharp and clean, like stone against metal. The movement stopped so abruptly that Varric's breath caught in his throat. The two stood locked for a moment, Mason's grip tightening just enough to make the scaled skin pale. Under the pressure, his voice was low but carried across the room. "You think you want to see," Mason said. "You think you can measure what I am in a room full of witnesses. You cannot. You will only see what I choose to show." Varric tried to pull his arm back, but found it did not move. Mason's grip was not just strong, it was absolute, like the closing of a trap that once set could not be opened without the will of the one who set it. Mason let the silence hang just long enough before he released the arm and stepped back without looking away. "You got your proof," Mason said, and then turned his back on Varric to walk toward his chair. The act alone sent a ripple through the chamber, for no one turned their back on Commander Varric, and yet Mason did, as if the man no longer mattered. Varric stood still, his arm tingling with the memory of the grip, his crest tilted slightly, as if reassessing something deep in his mind. He did not speak, instead lowering himself slowly back into his seat, his gaze never leaving the human marine. The council members exchanged looks, some wide-eyed, others narrowing their gaze, as they considered what had just unfolded. Commander Thress leaned forward, his voice measured. "That was not a fight," he set, his eyes on Mason. "That was a message." Mason did not answer. He simply sat back down, resting his hands on the chair. Once more, as if the matter was already done, the resin smoke curled in thin streams. Above the bowls, the light flickered against the walls, and in that flicker, every leader there knew something important had shifted. Varric finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "The human is what they say, he said to the room, and perhaps more. The words carried more weight than any praise or warning could have done. They were an acknowledgment from a warrior who had built his life on testing strength. The murmurs that followed were no longer filled with fear alone, but with a strange respect that none of them had expected to feel for someone they had met only that day. Mason looked toward the far wall, where a faint hum of machinery could be heard behind the panels, the sound of the station's life, support the steady rhythm of something that kept them all alive. It was a reminder that survival was not about comfort or trust. It was about knowing who could stand when the air turned thin and the walls shook with fire. The council began to speak again now, with fewer interruptions and sharper, focused. The arguments about whether to work with the humans were losing ground to the arguments about how to prepare for working with them, Mason said, nothing letting them reach their own conclusions while knowing the decision had already been made. Somewhere deep inside the silence between their words was the unspoken truth. They would remember Varick's failed strike, and Mason's calm grip far longer than they would remember any speech or record. They would carry it into the next vote, into the next meeting, into the next war. And Mason knew that was all he needed. The chamber was quieter now, though no one could call it calm. The air felt thick, as if holding its breath, along with everyone in the room. Mason sat still, his eyes half hidden under the shadow of the dim light, and the faint curl of resin smoke drifted toward the ceiling like a slow signal to something unseen outside the metal walls. The council members whispered to one another, their words low and uncertain. The events with Varick had changed the mood, but there was still one question hanging over them like the blade of a slow-swinging weapon. It was the question that had started all of this, and it weighted now heavier than before. Commander Thress leaned forward, his scaled fingers tapping once against the table. His voice was careful, as if stepping across fragile ice. Mason, you never answered, he said, his eyes fixed on the human. How many lives have you taken? The room stilled again, as if the air had been pulled from it. Everyone knew the story of the kill count question. The human had avoided it earlier with something between a warning and a refusal. Now, the moment had returned, sharper, more dangerous. Mason's head tilted slightly, as if considering whether the answer was worth giving. His gaze drifted over the council, not in challenge, but in a quiet assessment of each one who sat there, their ranks, their armor, their posture, all catalogued in the slow silence. He let the pause stretch until it was nearly unbearable before he spoke. Do you want this year, Mason said, his tone calm, like still water, or just this planet? A ripple went through the chamber. Some shifted back in their seats, others straightened, as if to better see the man before them. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that could not be measured in numbers alone. Varick's crest lowered slightly, his gaze sharpening at the implication. Thress blinked, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, another counselor, a tall avian figure with pale feathers and sharp black eyes, leaned forward, his voice unsteady. Just this planet. Mason leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests, his voice still level, but colder now, enough that it cut through the air in a way no blade could. 73, confirmed, Mason said without hesitation, and before the breath could return to the room, he added, that was before noon. The silence that followed was not simple shock. It was the silence of realization, the understanding that the human before them was not exaggerating, not bluffing, not shaping the truth. For effect, the counselor stared, as if trying to decide whether to fear him or to fear the fact that they needed him. Mason's gaze did not waver. The resin, smoke curling lazily between them. His voice was quiet, but carried to every ear in the room. You want numbers, because numbers feel safe. They're small, they fit in your head. They let you think you understand what they mean, but numbers are lies. They do not tell you the sound someone makes when they stop breathing. They do not tell you the smell of metal and earth mixed with blood. They do not tell you the weight in your arms when someone does not stand again. Varick's claws tapped once on the table, then stopped. He did not look away from Mason. There was something different in his gaze now, a recognition not of strength alone, but of the kind of endurance that could only be born in places where the air burned and the ground drank deep. The avian counselor leaned back, his feathers trembling slightly. Thress finally spoke, his voice low. Perhaps numbers are not what we should have asked for. No, Mason said, you should have asked why. The question hung there for a moment before Thress spoke again, then why? Mason's eyes drifted to the far wall, where the hum of the life support systems continued steady and unbroken. His voice came slow, each word deliberate, so that none could mistake them, because the ones I take are the ones who would take you, because I learned long ago that waiting for danger to come to you only gives it the time to grow sharper, because I have been to worlds that no longer breathe, and I have walked away from them when no one else could, and I will not let that happen here. The weight of his words settled over the chamber like a heavy cloak. There was no applause, no agreement spoken aloud, but the shift was clear. The fear that had filled the room when he first entered was no longer simple fear. It was fear tempered with the understanding that it could be used, fear that could be aimed. Thress looked to the others, and then back to Mason. "You will have what you need," he said. Mason gave a slow nod, but did not thank them, for in his mind this was not a gift, it was a necessity. The council began to murmur again, this time not about whether they could trust the human, but about how soon they could act, and how much could be done before the threat came to them. Varric finally stood, his scaled armor catching the light. He looked at Mason for a long moment, before giving a short nod of respect. It was not a bow and not an admission of defeat, but the kind of gesture one warrior gave to another when words were not enough. Mason returned the nod once, then looked back toward the wall, as if the conversation was already over. Beyond that wall, the station floated in the cold dark of space, surrounded by nothing but stars and the faint glimmer of distant worlds. But Mason knew the darkness was never empty. There was always something moving in it, always something watching and waiting. The hum of the life support sounded steady in his ears, but he knew it was only as steady as the hands willing to defend it. In the chamber, the council worked quickly, the murmurs turning to orders and the orders to plans. Mason sat silent, watching the slow shift of their faces as they realized the war they feared was not in the future. It was already here, and it had been for longer than they knew. Somewhere deep inside, Mason felt the familiar cold settle in the place where fear used to live, and he knew the question of his kill count would not be asked again, at least not by anyone in this room, for they now understood that the number was not the warning, it was the promise. And in the quiet moments before the next voice spoke, the council chamber seemed to grow smaller, as if the weight of what had been said had pulled the walls closer together, sealing them in with a man whose answer had terrified them, yet who might be the only reason they would live to see another sunrise in the endless dark of space.